Well, welcome to another Friday night. We're working through a reparenting series on recovery from trauma, is reparenting ourselves. And since we're coming into Christmas, I thought I would pick a theme that connects to what a lot of people go through Christmas. And I want to talk about stress. I talk about stress about once a year or so because of all the complex trauma issues. Stress is a core issue. It's an issue that continues to be activated, triggered, often without people realizing it. And so it's just an ongoing issue that people need to be aware of and have to deal with. And so today I want to talk about it, even though I've talked about it several times, but I want to give you some new information that I hope will be helpful. And I want to do it in light of Christmas. For many people, from complex trauma, Christmas is just a terrible time of year for them, and they have all their own reasons for that, but often it boils down to it really activates their stress system. So all of a sudden they're more stressed out than normal, and that's due to all the busyness of Christmas, the extra activities they have to go to. It's due to financial stress because of all the gifts they have to buy. It's the stress of buying gifts for people. It's the increased expectations that they have of others and that others have of them, that they have of themselves. And then Christmas can trigger a whole lot of memories that are very painful and stressful, and it can remind them of a whole bunch of losses that are very painful and stressful. And so for many of you listening, that's what you're going through, and that's what you're going to be going through over the next couple weeks. So I want to help you just process all of that from the perspective of stress. So I want to begin by saying stress is a very important system in our body. It is vital for our survival. It is a required system if we are going to survive in a world that has ups and downs, that is dangerous at times, that is full of problems at times. We need a stress system that is going to help us either confront the danger and the problems or escape the danger and the problems. And to confront the danger and the problems, not just that we face, but that those we love face. We want to protect and provide for them. What is fascinating to me about stress is it affects almost every part of our body. It is a whole body event. It involves almost every organ in our body, every system in our body. Everything in us is involved in responding to stress. So that's how big of an issue it is. Now, there's two ways that stress can show up, and this is really important to understand. So one we would call acute stress, and that would be in response to a one-time event or a short-term period of time of stressful events, and that is an immediate reaction, an intense reaction to short-term stress. A short-term threat. So you know that in order to survive, you have to go into survival mode. You have to respond a certain way if you're going to get through this and you're not going to get broken down mentally or physically. Once you get through that intense time, your body can return back to a place of balance. So that's the acute stress. And we often think of it as an extreme danger, but it can be extreme crises, problems. But then chronic stress. And this is the one for most people from complex trauma that they understand. It's a prolonged state of being under pressure. Sometimes you're not even aware of it, but it's still going on. So there's external pressures, but there's internal factors as well that are causing this prolonged stressed state. So it's a chronic, ongoing, unrelieved. But what is important to understand is that prolonged state gradually takes its toll. It begins to undermine our physical and mental integrity. So it wears us down. We do not return to a healthy, balanced state. It gradually wears us down. Gabor Mate has said this: it can make us anxious or depressed. It can suppress our immunity, promote inflammation in our body. It narrows blood vessels, which promotes vascular disease throughout the body. It encourages cancer growth. It can thin the bones. It can make us resistant to our own insulin, inducing diabetes. It can contribute to abdominal obesity, elevating the risk of cardiovascular problems. It can impair essential cognitive and emotional centers in the brain. It can elevate blood pressure, increase blood clotting, increasing the risk of heart attacks or strokes. All of that happens with chronic stress as it takes its toll on our body and on all the systems of the body. Gabor Mate cites 2 studies that have been done about stress in the heart. So 2012, Harvard did a study where women with more job stress are 67% more likely to experience a heart attack than those in less stressful jobs. And then, same time, University of Toronto, men who had been sexually abused as children had a triple rate of heart attacks. So they're seeing a connection between stress and heart issues. That's the chronic stress stuff. So let me take this further, and this is going to get a little bit technical, but I hope it helps you understand what is going on with this stress stuff and how it affects every part of our body. So understand there's this system called the HPA, and it's really the hub of the stress system. It kind of is the system that we use to describe. There's pathways that are feedback loops, and they're between the hypothalamus in the limbic brain, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal gland. So stress activates the hypothalamus, which activates the adrenal gland and the pituitary gland. And these are linked together, and that's the HPA system. The next thing to understand is this: our external bodies, they can tolerate and survive in a broad range of external conditions. It can be minus 40, plus 40, wet, dry, all of those different kinds of conditions, humans can live quite fine. The external body has learned to adapt to and tolerate a broad external environment. But what is important to understand is our internal environment isn't like that. It needs a very narrow range of conditions, and they include your internal body temperature, your heart rate, your blood acidity. All of those have to be in this very narrow margin for you to be okay. And if they go outside of that, you get very sick or die. So your internal world's ability to manage a broad range is very different than your external. So what they're finding is stress is the greatest challenge to the internal system because it wants to mess everything up. So they developed a term called allostasis. And it's basically the body's attempt to maintain that internal equilibrium in light of changing circumstances. So it's trying to keep everything within this narrow margin of consistency, even though everything's turbulent around it. So the word allo means variable. So you got variable circumstances. Stasis means standing, stoppage. So put them together, allostasis, it's staying calm, staying unchanged amidst change. So that's what the internal world is trying to do in order to survive. But what you have to understand is our bodies will go to great lengths to maintain allostasis, even though it puts tremendous wear on our bodies, on our system, because if they don't maintain allostasis, we will die. But they will sacrifice everything else in order to try to maintain allostasis. So that's what we call the allostatic load. And that is the strain it's putting on our body in order to regulate these very narrow systems that we need to survive. So what happens with stress is it's adding all of these things that need to be managed if we're going to survive. And so it puts this tremendous load, allostatic load on our bodies. And so whenever there's an extra allostatic load, it actually is increasing the stress to our bodies. And so our bodies begin to secrete the stress hormone cortisol. They secrete adrenaline. And then it leads to nervous tension. It affects our immune system. And it begins to wear down and to tire out the whole stress apparatus of our body. So whenever we're in danger, prolonged, chronic, or prolonged problems that we got to deal with, it is putting stress on our system, but in order to maintain allostasis, it's wearing itself out. And it's using cortisol and adrenaline to try to help it, give it energy, but that then begins to wear it down even more and affects our immune system and affects our mental health, and we head towards burnout. So that is what they're finding. So let me take it even further. What they're also finding is that the HPA system begins to happen very early in life. It's set up early in life, even in the uterus. And then it develops in the child's infant years. So that system of communication between the hypothalamus, the adrenal gland, and the adrenaline gland is set up very, very early. So what they're finding is the stress that the child experienced in utero or as an infant is what is determining how that system is set up. So take that further. What you can begin to realize is that the child in utero or very young is in a stressful situation or has parents who are all stressed out. That's going to affect the development of the HPA system. Okay, keep that in mind. Now we're going to go in a little different direction to the field of epigenetics. And this is fascinating to me. For many years, what the whole medical world has believed is your genes determine the diseases you get. So if you are genetically predisposed or born with these genes, you'll end up with cancer, with diabetes, with all kinds of different problems. And so the cause of disease was seen as genetic. But the field of epigenetics is challenging that, because what scientists have found out is that genes don't determine whether you get sick. That is not true. Only in a very few cases do genes determine whether you get a disease. What they have found is genes are like an alphabet. They're just all the different letters. They need another force, another system to come in and organize them to create words and sentences. That other force with genes is epigenetics. And epigenetics come in and they turn genes on or off based on their environment, based on stress. That's a big part of what causes this epigenetics thing to turn on a gene or to keep a gene turned off. So what that then says is my genes didn't cause me to become sick. It's the factors in my life, the stresses that turned that gene on, and then I got sick. So let's go back to the child. So a child in a stressful environment, their HPA axis is getting set up, which is then causing all of these systems to come into play to handle the allostatic load. But then their epigenetics is turning genes on just because of the stress of the environment. But it goes beyond that. It's not just the physical environment that the child is growing up in, whether it's dangerous or not. They're picking up their parents' stress. And that's affecting their stress load. But then they try to connect with their parents to help with their stress, but their parents aren't connecting with them. So now they feel all alone, and that increases their stress load. Then they have needs that they have that need to be met, and they try to get those needs met, but their needs aren't being met, and that increases their stress load. And then they have parents who are getting emotionally dysregulated and not regulating, and that affects their stress load. So what I want you to see is complex trauma isn't just about the physical environment. It's about not connecting to parents, not getting needs met, not having tools to regulate emotions, not having others regulate their emotions, and not being able to manage and deal with all of this stress. And so stress is just growing. And that is affecting epigenetics. That's affecting the HPA system. That's affecting the allostatic load. And you can see that all of that is beginning to affect the body. And so what they have found is it can affect their language, their body mass index, their obesity. It can result in asthma. It can even affect their IQ, and it affects their immune system. Everything else starts breaking down as the body is putting all of its energy into trying to manage this internal stress. Now let me add one more thing. There's a thing called telomeres. And telomeres, if you think of a shoelace, at the very end of a shoelace we have an egglet, a little plastic thing that kind of holds the end together so it doesn't fray. Well, when we come to chromosomes, telomeres are like that. They're at the very end of the chromosome like an egglet to keep it from fraying. And so what they found is as telomeres wear out, that's why we age. Because that chromosome now is going to start to fall apart and die. What they've now found is that telomeres, the little egglet that prevents the chromosome from wearing out too soon, it can wear out prematurely. There are other factors besides age that can cause it to wear out. And the biggest factor that causes a telomere to wear out is big T trauma and little t trauma. One-time event and chronic complex trauma. All of those cause the telomere to wear out. What they then have found is, so stress basically causes telomeres to wear out, which causes premature aging. And so people who have been living in chronic stress tend to live shorter. It shortens their lifespan. Fascinating. So stress, I hope you're seeing, messes up every system in the body. and it does damage. Now let me go back to a very basic thing. What is a healthy response to stress? What does a child need to handle stress? A child has no innate tools to handle stress. They have to be taught those tools. And so they need 3 things if they're going to learn to manage the problems, the stresses of life. Number 1, they need to connect to somebody who's safe, somebody who has the tools, somebody who can be trusted, somebody who's going to nurture them and help them. Connection is number 1. Number 2, they need that person to help them learn to co-regulate their emotions, to calm down, to get out of their limbic brain, to get into their cortex. They need somebody who will soothe them and comfort them. And then thirdly, they need that person to teach them practical tools for managing the situation. So here's what I want you to see, and this is critical. A child who experiences stress and fear initially is feeling it because of the external environment. But in a healthy home, that child would run to their parents, their safe rock, their refuge, their harbor. They would get connection, support, and soothing. The fear and the stress would be gone because now somebody's carrying that for me. Somebody's helping me to know how to carry it. What happens in complex trauma is that you don't get that connection, you don't get that soothing, you don't get those tools, so you continue in fear and stress. But here's the point. The fear and the stress is still partly about the external environment, but it's mainly about the inability to connect. If they could have only connected, that would have all been gone. So now they can't connect, so they still got to deal with the external stuff all alone, but now they have the stress and the shame and all of the pain of not being able to connect. So that lack of connection is really what keeps all the negative emotions going. So let me just add a few more things around complex trauma. I've covered much of this in the past, so I'll go through it quickly. So stress for everybody is a normal part of life, but in a healthy home, a child is getting connection and soothing and tools, so they're learning, and so they're able to manage stress at greater and greater levels and remain calm. And so the line keeps going up the more tools they get as to what they can manage comfortably. But in complex trauma, you don't get those tools. So a problem comes up, your only options are get hurt by the problem or fight, flight, or freeze. That becomes your way of coping with stress. But what I want you to see is you're not gaining more and more tools, so your tolerance for stress remains low. Therefore, your fight, flight, freeze response happens very quickly because of that. And so, your stress system is easily activated because of that. And every time you respond to a new problem, you get stress, it triggers a circuit in your brain, which is fight, flight, freeze. And those circuits get reinforced, and you get thousands of things that trigger those circuits. All to fight, flight, freeze. Those triggers, the more they're reinforced, trigger nanosecond fight, flight, freeze. You don't take time to think if there's another way to learn a tool. You just go right into that brain circuit. And so that can become debilitating for people with complex trauma who are adults, who have a low tolerance for stress, who are still in the fight, flight, freeze before they even realize it. And the challenge of creating new brain circuits, of not giving into the impulse in that nanosecond to fight, flight, freeze, but to use new tools is very, very difficult. And then it's not just stress that creates discomfort that makes me want to fight, flight, freeze. It becomes any uncomfortable emotion that creates the impulse to want to fight, flight, freeze. But this is where it can get tricky. Most children from complex trauma grew up in high stress environments. Life was chaotic. They couldn't connect. They weren't given tools. They weren't given nurture. But that was their normal. And so stress feels normal. And now as they start to get healthy and they learn tools and they get organized and they get routines, that begins to feel boring because it's very much lower in the chaos department than what their normal was. And so it's a new thing to get used to that feels weird for a while. And because of that, many, once they start feeling bored, they actually get attracted to go back to chaos, to feel alive again, because boring feels dead. And so it's important to be aware of the tendency to sabotage good stuff because it feels boring, to go back to chaos and drama because it makes you feel alive. There's another part of this. When stress was your normal, that meant that your sympathetic nervous system was out of balance with your parasympathetic nervous system. A healthy life is you have stresses, you resolve them, and your parasympathetic comes in to rejuvenate and rest you. But in complex trauma, your sympathetic nervous system is going all the time and your parasympathetic can't kick in properly, and so it's out of balance. And that creates sleep problems, anxiety issues, depression issues. It can lead to physical burnout, emotional burnout or breakdown. And so part of what has happened is your normal is not just chaos, your normal is a sped up sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic that doesn't know how to work. And then that, when you try to get that balanced out, what can happen for many people is as soon as you start using your parasympathetic nervous system properly and you learn to rest, you feel guilty. You feel like you're being lazy. You feel like you're being selfish. And so you gotta go through an uncomfortable time of getting to a new normal that's healthy. Another problem that can come out of complex trauma is that when your system is activated today, it's still based on the HPA that was designed in your youth, as an infant even. And so then a response was a 10 because you had 0 tools. So danger, response of 10. So today, you could be in a situation where it's a 3 out of 10, but when your stress system is activated, you still respond with a 10 response. Your response isn't in keeping with the actual situation, but that's how your stress system still operates because that's what it needed to survive. And so that can be very difficult if you're in a relationship and your partner, it's a 3 situation, your partner responds in a 10 because they haven't dealt with their issues. You respond with a 3 and your partner's mad at you and says you don't care about me because you didn't respond with a 10. And you go, I respond with a 3 because it only warrants a 3, and now they feel that you're saying they're stupid or they're bad. And that can create a whole bunch of problems. Many still struggle with learning to self-regulate, but then we're our own worst enemies. If you come out of complex trauma, you probably still live with very unrealistic expectations of yourself or others, and that's going to increase your stress. You still may have some control issues, wanting to control everything. That's going to increase your stress. Or you might not plan very well. That's going to increase your stress. You might be a procrastinator and avoid and put off doing things. That's going to increase your stress. You might be afraid to say no to people for fear they'll get mad at you. And you're afraid to set boundaries. That's going to increase your stress. You might be drawn into unhealthy relationships where there's going to end up being more drama. That's going to increase your stress. Your shame might cause you to be preoccupied with what other people think of you. That's going to increase your stress. You might have a guilty conscience and you don't want to admit that you're wrong. That's going to increase your stress. You might still have fear of change or sitting in the unknown or fear of failure. Any type of anxiety is going to increase your stress. You may have a bunch of resentments from your past that you haven't resolved and you don't want to resolve. That's going to increase your stress. You might have a tendency still to be very negative in your thinking and to jump to the worst case scenario. That's going to increase your stress. You might still fall into feeling sorry for yourself, playing the victim, self-pity. That's going to increase your stress. You may still operate by the belief that you can't be a burden to anybody. You got to do everything yourself. That's going to increase your stress. You might still be addicted to chaos and be drawn into chaotic activities. That's going to increase your stress. So we can end up being our worst enemy and produce a lot of our own stress because we haven't dealt with our issues. Let me say this. I've been in this field for 20 years, and complex trauma is all about stress. It's all about the stress system and it getting messed up. Most people with complex trauma aren't even aware of how messed up their stress system is. If you've been operating as a little child in an environment that was a 10 out of 10 stress, and that was your normal, for many of you to now operate with stress levels that are just 3s and 4s, you're probably not even aware of them. They don't even hit your radar. It doesn't even feel like stress. But what I want you to realize, it is stress, and it is activating your stress system in your subconscious, below your radar, without you realizing it. But it could be pushing you to fight, flight, or freeze, and you're not even aware of it. And all of a sudden, you're starting to disconnect and dissociate and getting into bad decisions, and you haven't even clued in yet that stress is the problem. And so a huge issue for many people from complex trauma is to begin to be aware of the stress levels that are 2, 3, and 4 that have previously been below their radar. So it's developing a new radar system that picks up stress earlier, before you start to dissociate, before you start to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so what I hope you realize is that retraining your stress system, which has been operating in the subconscious and doing it since you were an infant, is a big task, but it's a slow task. It's not going to happen overnight. So let's just talk about this very quickly. Practical tools. So in dealing with stress, we have what we call top-down tools and bottom-up, and it refers to the brain. So top-down is the top of the brain, the cortex, taking truth in the cortex and moving it to affect the rest of you. Bottom-up is saying, I can't access my cortex right now because the stress is too high, so I got to come up through the brain stem and the limbic brain and find ways with my body to calm them down. So top down works for most for a degree, but once the stress gets to a certain point, your top down tools will stop working. You then have to use the bottom-up tools, and that's okay. So top-down we talk about all the time. Learning to set boundaries, thinking through your priorities, making a list of things to do and planning your days in doable steps, and not procrastinating. All of those help stress. Talking regularly to your support people, taking good self-care, so getting good exercise, sleep, eating, taking emotional self-care, spiritual self-care, such important top-down things. Then learning healthy, fun, play escapes that bring in your sympathetic nervous system and help you relax. Learning to silence the inner critic in your brain with healthy self-talk. So you remind yourself of the truth of life. You confront the lies that the critic is telling you. Practical problem solving, learning how to think through situations and weigh out pros and cons. Being willing to ask for help. And then recognizing that sometimes when I'm in a stressful situation, I can back away and get a big perspective and say, oh, my child is teething. This is temporary. It's not going to last forever. I don't need to panic. I just need to get through the next week or so. So I'm going to have to sit in it for a while, and I can do that. All of this is important to also process from another perspective, which is this stressful situation is starting to trigger things. Mindfulness. Is there a deeper issue that it's pointing to that I need to work on? So stress can actually be a teacher. It can guide us to issues that we need to focus on. So that's top down. Now bottom up is when the stress is so great that I can't think my way out of it. Then I need my body to help regulate my brain stem and my limbic brain. So grounding, breathing, mindfulness, meditation, taking time to be quiet. Yoga has been a big thing. Pet therapy is very helpful. Progressive muscle relaxation, so tensing all the muscles, then relaxing the muscles. Music, walking, art therapy, a hobby, all of those are wonderful bottom-up ways of dealing with stress. So, as you head into Christmas, I hope that just gives you a few insights and tools that will help you through this time. That's the end of part one. We're going to take a short break, and then I'm going to come back for the Christian spiritual part. If that doesn't interest you, fine, no problem. Not offended at all. You're free to go. We'll see you next time. Everybody else will be back in just a minute. Well, welcome back. I thought that since we were just talking about stress and it's Christmas coming up, that I talk about stress and Christmas from the Bible story of Christmas. And part of what I want to do is this. I think a lot of Christians have the perception, the idea, the belief that they somehow picked up that the more spiritual you get, you become immune to stress. Stress doesn't bother you anymore. And so it's, if I get spiritual, then I'll never be stressed. Stress just won't be an issue. I'll be calm and serene all the time. I believe that spirituality does affect our ability to handle stress. And we're going to talk about that. But as you look at the Bible, what you begin to realize is that even the most spiritual people alive had times of great stress, and that great stress affected them greatly. And they weren't afraid to show that and admit that. And so we really need to get away from the idea that if you're spiritual, then stress isn't going to be an issue for you. Yes, there will be times when it is a big issue. So let me just take the Christmas story. I think that was probably the most stressful time of Joseph and Mary's life. Number one, all of a sudden Mary's pregnant. And Joseph says, I'm not the dad. So now you've got stress in their relationship because he's going, how did you get pregnant? Did you sleep with somebody? And when she says, no, God got me pregnant, he's going, oh yeah, right, that's the first I've heard that one. So Mary's feeling stressed. There's tension in the relationship. And then there's the community gossip that starts. And all of the looks and the shunnings that begin to happen. So stressful. Then they get a thing that there's a census taken by the government, and they have to go 80 miles through very rugged mountainous territory to Joseph's hometown of his ancestors, Bethlehem. And Mary is 8.5 months pregnant. Think of the stress of going 80 miles in that state as a teenage girl, first time pregnancy, to travel. A lot of it walking. Very stressful. Then they get to Bethlehem and they can't find a place to stay. Everybody's full, all the hotels. And so now the stress of labor is starting. There's nobody that's going to give them a place to stay. What are they going to do now with the baby's coming? And so finally, you imagine the stress of that. And finally, somebody says, hey, I got a building out back. There's some animals there, but you're welcome to use that to give birth to the baby. And they go through the stress of giving birth to the baby. I can't imagine the stress of all of that. And then shortly after the baby's born, now what do? They stay in Bethlehem for a while, but then they get news that the King Herod, has heard about this baby, and that others are saying it's the new king, and he feels threatened, and he's put out a decree to have the baby killed. And so now they have to flee, and they're refugees, and they go to Egypt, the nearest country, 200 miles away. And they got to travel at night because there's soldiers out looking for this baby. Imagine the stress of that with a tiny baby that's still going to cry when it gets hungry and make noises. That would have been an extremely stressful time. Then they get to Egypt, new country, new culture, no job, don't know the language, or as well as they should. They're seen as foreigners. All kinds of stress with that. And so the whole first 2 years of Jesus' life was basically constant, intense stress. And Joseph and Mary had to manage that stress together. That just blows my mind. But let me now go to the life of Jesus once he gets into his ministry. It was times of intense stress, times where he purposely took breaks from the stress in order to rest, in order to spend time with his Father. So Jesus learned how to manage stress, but he still experienced intense stress. He had crowds wanting to see him from morning till night, thronged by people. And then he just gets away from the crowds, and then he's got the 12 disciples that he's mentoring. And they can act very immature at times, and he's got to deal with their stuff. And then as his popularity grows, the religious leaders see him as a threat, and they hate him and want to kill him. So he's got stress after stress after stress coming at him. And then I think it got so bad at times, he was just so exhausted that even in the middle of a storm, he's asleep. He's just exhausted. But here's the part I want you to see. When the night before Jesus is to die, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prays to his Father and he says, please take this cup. And this cup was the metaphor in his mind of what he was going to have to drink in the hours ahead, of the torture, the dying, the experiencing, everything he would experience when he died on Calvary. All of that was in his cup. And what we're told is as he looked into the cup, the stress was so great, he began to sweat drops of blood. And what we know medically is under the most severe, almost unimaginable stress, the body will actually secrete blood that will come out like sweat drops. And so what that tells you is Jesus was experiencing a level of stress that most of us will never experience, but he was experiencing it, and he was crying to his Father. He was saying, I am so overwhelmed. I am so depressed right now. I feel like I'm going to die. Please take this from me. So even Jesus had times of stress that overwhelmed him. He also had times where the stress was so great that he had to go into hiding for a bit to get away from it. And so even the most godly people, Jesus included, but you can go to Paul and he talks about the times of stress and how depressed he got with that and overwhelmed he felt. Being spiritual doesn't take away stress. Being spiritual doesn't mean that we won't have times of being overwhelmed by stress. But being spiritual means that even in those times of being overwhelmed, we still go to God. We still use our supports. We still use our tools. And then we get through it. But we still got to go through times of stress. I hope that helps. Let's pray. God, again, thank you for these very raw, real, true examples of the most godly people in the world dealing with incredibly stressful times. And just keep us from thinking that somehow we should be immune to stress. And help us to turn to you and to the right tools when those stressful times come. Amen. Well, thank you again for being with us and being part of this. Hopefully you have a great week and going into Christmas as well. And we'll see you next time.